What's the scariest true story you've ever heard? Story 1. About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and living alone in a one-bedroom apartment. The place was clean and the rent was decent. It was one of those places that had a doorman, and I felt safe there. I was alone and loving it, focused on my career and not on my clingy ex-husband. Things were finally looking up for me. At the time, I was working pretty late at the office and would often stumble into my apartment sleep-deprived in the early hours of the morning and wake up by 6:30 or 7 to start the day. I started noticing that in the morning, my door would be unlocked sometimes. I usually dismissed this as my tired brain, thinking that the bed looked more appealing than locking the door. Another thing that I noticed since moving in was that I seemed to misplace things more than I used to. Little things like a hairbrush or nail polish, that sort of thing. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just enough to be a slight annoyance in my day. The longer I lived there, the more frequently I seemed to forget to lock the door. At first it was every once in a while, then it seemed like an almost daily occurrence. More things went missing. Things like pictures, shaving razors, and most disturbingly, my underwear. This went on for long enough that I started to get a little paranoid. I started to take the time at night to make sure the door was locked. I got into a habit of, every night after I locked the door, turning the handle 3 times and saying to myself, "It's locked, it's locked, it's locked." Time after time, I would wake up and the door would be unlocked. One time I even tried staying up all night to watch the door, but I ended up falling asleep in my chair. I decided that my mind was not reliable enough to stay up all night, so I invested in a video camera. I went all out and bought the fanciest camera I could get my hands on. So one night, I set the camera up facing the door. I hid the camera under a pile of towels on the floor. I locked the door and went to bed. When I woke up, my apartment looked normal. Nothing was missing that I could see. I decided to check the tape. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, not seeing anything. I was just about to give up when I noticed the handle of the door jitter. Then it slowly crept open. A figure slid through the half-open door and walked toward the camera. It paused, looked around as if it was listening for something, then walked forward into direct view of the camera. I paused the video. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to rise. I was staring directly into the face of the maintenance man of the building. I could see those big, thick glasses and curly hair. I had no doubt who it was. I played the tape a little more. He looked comfortable as he walked around the apartment. Then he turned and walked towards my bedroom and out of the camera's view. I didn't know what to do. Sobbing, I called the police. I tried to explain over the phone but couldn't. Soon enough, 2 officers arrived at my doorstep. I told them everything and showed them the tape. I remember seeing the blood drain from their faces. They promised me that I was safe and that they were going to get this guy. I needed to lie down, but didn't want to be alone. One of the officers offered to stand outside my apartment door as I took a nap. As I was lying in bed, unable to sleep but too drained to move, something kept nagging at me. I lay there for a few minutes, tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or rest. My mind was racing. Then a realization slowly washed over me and chilled me to the bone. We watched the tape and saw the man enter my home, but we never saw him leave. I froze, then started shaking. I needed to get to the front door. I sat up and looked around the room. I couldn't see anyone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed cautiously. My feet hit the cold wood floor, and I felt warm breath on my ankles. I raced out of my apartment as fast as I could and to the safety of the police officer. He called for backup. They found the man under my bed, clutching a knife and a Polaroid camera. Story 2. There were once a couple of friends riding along the backwoods of some no-name town very, very late at night, around 11:30. They were pretty lost and had no idea where they were going, as they had stopped for gas about an hour before and were told that the way they were going was a shortcut. Well, it so happened this was no shortcut, and then out of nowhere the front of the car started smoking. They got out, and the engine was overheating way too much to drive. Lucky for them, they saw a sign that read "Motel Ahead." They walked about 10 minutes, and sure enough, there was a motel. They gave each other a look like, "What on earth is a motel doing way out here?" They were too tired to care, so they opened the old wooden door and rang the service bell. No answer, so they turned around, and this old creepy man asked, "Can I help you?" One of the friends screamed, and the creepy man laughed and apologized, saying he had been out back doing some duties. He asked the friends if they would like a room, and now being very late and very tired, they allowed the man to show them their room. As the man showed them their room, he said, "Don't be afraid of the dark." He shut the door and locked it. The two friends, now wanting to get some sleep, turned in for the night, but one of them needed to use the bathroom. Sure enough, the only thing lighting up the bathroom was a small candle. Just when he thought everything was fine and calm, he flushed the toilet and turned around when all of a sudden, no clean towels. Story 3. A man was driving his usual route along the highway when he noticed a turnoff that led up through the mountains. He figured he drove this way all the time, but had never taken the mountain path, even though it would only add a few hours to his trip. On a sudden impulse, he took the turn and began his journey up the winding road. He had started his drive later in the day than usual, so the sky was getting dark as he approached the top, but the view was breathtaking. While continuing, he felt a small chill at the base of his neck, but dismissed it as the cool mountain air. Not long after, he had to slow his car as he approached what appeared to be a terrible car accident. Two cars were completely destroyed, looking as if they had hit each other head-on just after rounding a corner. He could see several bodies on the ground, bloodied and motionless. Instinctively, he knew he had to pull over and help, but a strange feeling crept over him. Something about the scene didn't feel right, almost unnatural. He decided to drive his car forward and park just beyond the crash site before getting out to assist. He slowly crept by the wreck and managed to get a clearer look at one of the bodies. It was definitely human, yet something about it seemed off, though he couldn't pinpoint what. He rolled the car forward maybe 6 meters from the crash site, and just as he was about to stop and open his door, he glanced out his front windshield. It was now terribly dark, nearly pitch black, when something in his rearview mirror caught his eye. Several things, in fact. As he stared into the mirror in horror, he saw the bodies at the crash site illuminated by his rear lights. All of them were sitting up, staring directly at his car, their eyes glowing like orbs. Panic set in as more figures began emerging from the ditches and forest around the road. But when the crash victims began to stand, moving normally without limping or dragging, he snapped into action, throwing the car into drive. By the time the first figure stepped toward the vehicle, he was already speeding away as fast as he could, racing down the mountain. Nothing ever came for him, nor did it seem he was followed. Still, sometimes he wonders if his mind played a trick on him, yet to this day, he always checks his rearview mirror before ever stepping out of his car. Story 4. A teenage girl was asked to babysit two young sisters on a Friday evening. She had watched them many times before, so it was nothing unusual. The parents left for the night, saying they wouldn't be home until around midnight. The teenager put the girls to bed around 9 and then went downstairs to relax, turning on the television. She watched for about an hour, and by then it was getting late. The living room was on the main floor, with the television in a corner and large windows on either side. Out of the corner of her eye, she suddenly thought she saw someone walking past the window outside through the bushes. Her heart pounded. Panicked, she called emergency services, and officers arrived soon after. They checked around the property, but found no footprints or signs of anyone nearby. It was winter and snow covered the ground. They reassured her that she was safe, explaining that the lighting from the television and lamp had likely caused reflections that tricked her eyes. Relieved but still uneasy, she asked the officers to check inside the house, just to be certain. They agreed, though somewhat skeptically, and began inspecting each room, closet, and even the garage. They were nearly finished when they discovered something that made their blood run cold. A man hiding under one of the little girls' beds. It turned out to be the children's mother's ex-husband. The babysitter hadn't seen someone walking past the window outside. What she had actually seen was his reflection as he moved behind the couch. Story 5. This happened to me, and it still freaks me out whenever I'm home alone. When I was 16, a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day, and my sister went out too. I live in a small, average suburban neighborhood. I was stuck in the house, bored, with only my dog for company. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to work, I had to open the garage door because the back of the air conditioner faces the garage, and the heat builds up there. Usually when we do this, We locked the garage door that leads into the living room, but this one time I forgot. I sat down in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later in the afternoon, I heard my dog barking like crazy. I almost ignored it, but went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed my sister had come home, so I yelled, "It's not locked!" She didn't respond, and the doorknob jiggled even more violently. I walked toward the door, yelling again, "It's not locked!" When the door opened, it felt like slow motion. The door creaked open just a crack, but that was all I needed to see. I saw feet, huge, dark brown hiking boots belonging to a man, not my sister. I immediately pushed on the door to close it again and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I managed to struggle and push it shut, then locked it. He started pounding on the door, but then it stopped. Still sobbing, I grabbed my dog and ran to the kitchen to get a knife. As soon as I got there, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps on the cement path. Just like in a horror movie, with tears streaming down my face, I screamed, "No!" Dog in one hand and knife in the other, I dropped the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife again, my legs were shaking so badly that they gave out, and I fell forward. I tried to get up, but ended up crawling and tripping on the floor, accidentally cutting my bare foot with the knife. I hid under the dining room table and started praying. I thought this was it, that I was going to die there, in the quiet house, with my dog as a witness. I held my hand over my mouth to stifle my sobs when I heard footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing, and I clutched the knife tightly as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds as he peered inside. He stood there for what felt like forever and then walked away. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked whenever the garage doors open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog hadn't barked and alerted me that a man was trying to break in. I could have been in my room, completely unaware, until it was too late. Story 6. A young girl named Lisa was often left alone at night because her parents worked late. To keep her company, they bought her a dog. One night, Lisa was awoken by a constant dripping sound. She got up and went to the kitchen to make sure the tap was turned off properly. As she got back into bed, she stuck her hand under it, and the dog licked her hand. The dripping sound continued, so she went to the bathroom and turned off the tap there as well. She returned to her room, stuck her hand under the bed again, and felt the dog lick it once more. But the dripping didn't stop. Drip, drip, drip. This time she listened carefully and realized the sound was coming from her closet. She opened the closet door, and there was her dog hanging upside down, skinned with a pool of blood beneath it. Written on the window, in blood, were the words, "Humans can lick hands too." Story 7. In Cuba, where we are all from, summers can get unbearably hot. With most people unable to afford air conditioning, it was common to sleep with doors and windows open. One night, my Aunt T was putting her grandchildren to bed. She laid beside them, the only adult home. Her sister Berta was supposed to stay that night, but a last-minute change made her sleep elsewhere. Around 9 in the evening, my aunt noticed a figure that she swears was nearly 7 feet tall. It looked human, but seemed to glide instead of walk. If it had legs, she couldn't see them. A long robe dragged across the floor as it moved. Instead of screaming, she stayed perfectly still so she wouldn't wake the children. She watched it cross the hallway and enter her bedroom. The figure loomed above them, and my aunt could see its face. Pale skin, big red lips, and dreadlocks like a Rastafarian man. Where its eyes should have been were dark, hollow cavities. It left her room the same way it entered but didn't exit the house. My aunt says it glided through every room, pausing briefly in each before finally drifting out the front door. The next morning, her sister Berta was found dead. Everyone believed it was a heart attack or stroke, as she was discovered peacefully in her bed. But my aunt still cries when she talks about that night. She is convinced that what she saw was death itself, searching for her sister where she was meant to be. Story 8. Last year, I worked with a man who had spent years on oil rigs in the North Sea. He told me about a massive storm that hit one night, shaking the whole platform, though he said storms like that were common. The next morning, they went to inspect the damage. There was a platform near the waterline that had partially sunk. Normally, it stayed just above the waves. Since he was the new guy, he was sent down first. He said the structure looked barely intact, as if it could collapse at any moment. When he reached the lowest level, he stepped onto the section touching the water, and immediately it started sinking fast. He ran up the stairs, and as soon as he reached the next level, the entire section beneath him broke off and vanished into the sea. What terrified him wasn't just that it fell. It looked like something had pulled it down. He said it was as if giant hands had gripped the metal and yanked it until it tore apart. Whatever it was, it only moved when he stepped into the water, almost like it had been waiting. After that, strange things kept happening. Metal ladders snapped, pipes were sheared off, and all of it occurred during storms. Sometimes workers disappeared, and the company blamed leaks or accidents. He said they eventually evacuated the rig, officially due to a gas leak. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was what lived beneath them, something powerful enough to drag steel into the deep. And according to him, it wasn't the only rig in the North Sea where it happened. Story 9. My friend recently told me a story that his sister shared with him. She had 3 friends who went to Mexico for a week of fun and partying. One night while they were at a bar, one of the girls suddenly disappeared. Her phone went dead, and she was nowhere to be found. Her 2 friends assumed she had gone back to the hotel or met someone. The next morning, she still hadn't returned. Days later, as they drove toward the United States border, they spotted her sitting in a car full of men beside them on the highway. Overjoyed, they waved and yelled, but she didn't react at all. No movement, no sign she saw them. They alerted the Border Patrol, reporting that their missing friend had been spotted. Officers stopped the car and investigated. What they found was horrifying. Their friend was dead. Her body had been hollowed out, her organs removed, and filled with substances. Her corpse had been propped up in the seat, dressed and posed as if she were alive. The thought of her friends screaming and waving to her lifeless body, the same person they had laughed with the night before, is something that still haunts me every time I think about it. Story 10. My cousin was in a band that toured for a while, and he once met another group from Illinois with a disturbing story. They were broke and relied on fans to give them places to crash after shows. One night after performing, a fan offered them a room in his house. He said his parents were very religious and wouldn't be home that night. Curious, the band asked if his parents were away on a church mission. He just gave them a strange smile and didn't answer. Later that night, they got hungry and joked about raiding the fridge, but decided against it since their host was being so nice. A few days later, they saw a news report about a young man who had murdered his parents, chopped them up, and stored their remains in the freezer. The suspect was the same fan who had let them stay in his home. While they had been joking about getting a late-night snack, his parents' bodies had been right there, frozen behind the refrigerator door. Story 11. This story was told to me by my aunt. My apologies for any missing details since my grandmother passed away years before I was born, and I can't be certain how true it is. My mother was one of 10 children, and when she was a teenager, her parents and some of her siblings moved east. According to my aunts and uncles, something strange was always happening around that house. They heard voices, footsteps running upstairs when no one was there, a rocking chair moving on its own, and other odd things. Eventually, my grandmother was diagnosed with brain cancer. She was recovering at home after surgery, completely bedridden. My aunt was taking care of her alone. At this point, it was physically impossible for my grandmother to walk. She had a habit of blotting at her healing incisions with tissues, which wasn't good for her recovery, so the tissue box was kept across the room. One day, my aunt brought in her lunch and set the tray on her lap. My grandmother asked for tissues for her head, and my aunt reminded her that she shouldn't touch the incisions. Then my grandmother asked for a drink. My aunt went to the kitchen, but when she came back, she saw her mother with the tissues blotting her scalp. Shocked, she took them away and reminded her again not to do that. Then it hit her. Her mother couldn't walk, so she asked, "Mom, how did you get these?" My grandmother calmly replied, "Oh, that little girl who always follows you around gave them to me." Story 12. This is a story about my friend who lives in a city apartment complex. The building is 10 stories high, and he lives on the 8th floor. One night around 11, he entered the lobby to head home. As he waited for the elevator, a man rushed out and bumped into his shoulder before quickly leaving the building. My friend didn't think much of it until he got home and saw smears of blood on the same shoulder the man had hit. The next morning, he was getting ready for a date when he heard a knock on the door. Looking through the peephole, he saw a policeman, a man in his mid-40s with short dark hair and a shaved-off left eyebrow. The officer asked, "There was a murder last night around 10:50, and I'd like to know if you saw anything unusual." My friend had indeed seen something unusual, the bloody man, but he didn't want to get involved and was already running late. He told the officer, "No, sir, I didn't see anything." The man thanked him and left. Later that day, my friend returned from his date, feeling guilty about lying. He turned on the television, and the news was covering the murder in his building. As he watched, the report announced that the killer had been caught. When the image appeared on the screen, his stomach dropped. It was the same man he had spoken to earlier, the one pretending to be a police officer. The man with the short dark hair and the shaved-off left eyebrow wasn't there to investigate. He was there to find and kill anyone who might have seen him. Story 13. This actually happened to me when I was visiting my grandmother in Mexico City. She lived in a big 2-story house, and we were upstairs in the bedrooms. It was very late, and she had already gone to sleep, but I stayed up watching television. Suddenly, I heard an animal roaring loudly outside my open window. It wasn't a normal sound. It was deep and powerful, more like a lion or a tiger. It made no sense. We were in the middle of the city, far from any wilderness. The zoo was across town, so it couldn't have come from there. The roaring and growling went on for over an hour, pacing back and forth along the street below my window. I was terrified but couldn't bring myself to look. Finally, I gathered some courage, went to my grandfather's study, grabbed his gun, loaded it, and returned to my room. I sat there in the dark, praying that whatever was making that noise wouldn't notice the light from my window. After a while, the sound began to fade, as if it were moving farther away. When it seemed safe, I looked outside but saw nothing. Only the empty street, though I could still hear the roars echoing in the distance. The next morning, I scoured the news for any mention of an escaped animal, but there was nothing. No one else had reported hearing anything strange that night. I never told anyone for years. Even now, I have no idea what that thing was. Story 14. I've been lying down for hours now. It's 5:35 in the morning, and there's not much I can do. You know what the worst part about my situation is? I'm in the same room as my parents. They keep looking at me, and I can't help but look back and try not to cry or scream. Their eyes are fixed on me, and their mouths are wide open. There's a strong scent of blood in the air, and I feel completely paralyzed with fear. The second I make any hint that I'm not asleep anymore, I'm completely doomed. I will die, and there's nobody around to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only idea I have is to rush for the front door and scream for help, hoping a neighbor will hear me. It's risky, but if I stay here, I'm sure to die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up and went to check, but halfway there I realized I had to use the bathroom. Instead of investigating, I went into the bathroom first. There was blood on the carpet. I started to panic and ran back to my room, hiding under the sheets like the coward I was, trying to convince myself it was just a vivid nightmare. But then I heard my bedroom door open. Like the terrified child I was, I peeked out from under the blankets to see what was happening. I saw something dragging my parents into the room, lifeless. It was not human, I can tell you that. It had no hair, no eyes, no clothes. It moved hunched over like a caveman, dragging their bodies with its long, thin arms. But this thing was far more intelligent than any caveman. It was deliberate and aware of what it was doing. It propped my father up on the edge of my bed so that he faced me, and it placed my mother in the chair, turning her toward me as well. Then it started rubbing its hands against the walls, smearing them with blood, before drawing a large circle with a pentagram inside it. This thing had made what it clearly thought was a masterpiece. When it was done, it used its bloody fingers to write something on the wall that I couldn't read in the darkness. Then, without a sound, it crawled under my bed. That's where it's been ever since. Now that my eyes have adjusted to the darkness, I can finally read what it wrote. I don't want to, because I know once I look, I won't be able to unsee it, but part of me feels like I have to know before I die. Story 15. It may not seem that scary, but this really happened to me, and it's one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. In 2002, right after I got married, my husband and I went on a road trip to visit his brother at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. This was before navigation systems were common, so we printed the route from Yahoo Maps and followed the directions the old-fashioned way. We were both pretty naive and didn't know much about the area. At one point, we started seeing mountains in the distance. I said, "I think we're driving through the Appalachian Mountains." My husband laughed and told me I was making it up because he had no sense of geography. Later, when we stopped at a gas station to get a map, it turned out I was right. The map showed the same road appearing multiple times, and I, in my overconfidence, decided that we should just take it the next time it appeared to save some time. So we did. It was about 2 in the morning, pitch black outside, and we found ourselves deep in the woods. We came to a fork in the road and had no idea which way to go because we had veered completely off course. Panic started to rise in me, and I began crying, convinced that something about this place wasn't right. My husband told me to calm down and said he'd call his dad, who used to be a truck driver and knew roads like the back of his hand. We pulled out our phones, but there was no signal. That made my fear worse. My husband took a deep breath and said, "My gut says left." I didn't have any better ideas, so we went left. After what felt like forever, we finally saw lights ahead, a gas station. Relief washed over me. It turned out to be one of those highway stations that you can pull directly in and out of. As we approached, we noticed a few people sitting outside in lawn chairs chatting. They seemed surprised to see us, especially since it was 2:30 in the morning and we were two Latino strangers far from anywhere familiar. We explained that we had gotten lost after leaving the main road and had taken a wrong turn trying to save time. I'll never forget the woman's reaction. Her expression changed completely. Her whole body shuddered like she had just gotten a chill. Then she looked me straight in the eyes and said, in a low, serious voice, "Never, ever, ever get off that highway. Those are the back roads, and you don't want to know what's out there." Her tone sent a wave of dread through me. We thanked her, got back into the car, and immediately rejoined the highway without looking back. 2 years later, we were watching a movie called Wrong Turn. The premise was nearly identical. People get lost in the Appalachian woods after taking the wrong road. Watching that movie, I felt the same fear rise in me again. My heart was pounding, and my hands went cold. What if we had gone right instead of left that night? I still think about it sometimes and get chills, wondering what could have happened to us on those dark, empty back roads. Story 16. This actually happened to me, and I still can't believe how it all turned out. My ex-girlfriend, she's my ex now because of this, had a strange habit of talking in her sleep or right after waking up. Sometimes it was random nonsense, and I got used to it. But one night, while I was lying next to her reading I'll Never Get Out of Here Alive by Steve Earle, she suddenly woke up and said something that froze me. She told me I'd killed a lot of people I knew, that I was dangerous. Her tone was different from her usual sleepy mumbling, more serious, more sinister. Freaked out, I asked, "What are you talking about? Who did I kill? How?" She looked at me with this eerie calmness and said, "You strangled them while they were sleeping, and you were going to strangle me right now, but I woke up." I stared at her, speechless. "Are you being serious?" I asked. Then she suddenly laughed and said, "No, of course not. You should have seen your face. Well, of course, I don't think you'd strangle me." I didn't find it funny at all. I was shaken, but mostly angry. I decided I'd get back at her somehow. She was easy to scare, so I planned to give her a real fright. Something harmless, but unforgettable. A few days later, while browsing online for creepy ideas, I remembered a conversation I'd had with a kid from the skate park named Sebastian. He told me about black-eyed kids, eerie children with pitch-black eyes who supposedly knock on people's doors asking to come in, claiming they need help or a phone. Those who've seen them say they radiate pure dread, yet also seem to have some strange, hypnotic influence that makes you want to obey. Sebastian was obsessed with the stories. He even bought black contact lenses for Halloween. That was it. I had my prank idea. That night, I told my girlfriend all about the legend. I read her some of the creepiest eyewitness accounts I could find, describing the black eyes, the knocking, the pleading voices. She believed every word. Of course she did. She was into ghost shows, conspiracy theories, all that paranormal stuff. The next day, I went to the skate park and told Sebastian my plan. He loved it. I handed him my spare key to the building and told him to come by the next night at 8, when she'd be home alone. All he had to do was knock on the door wearing those black lenses and ask to be let in. She'll freak out, I said. But don't worry, she won't do anything crazy. She'll just scream and slam the door. He agreed immediately. The next evening, I came home from work around 9 to find my girlfriend in a complete state of hysteria. She was shaking, sobbing uncontrollably, screaming, "They were here! The black-eyed kids were here. I almost let them in before I noticed their eyes. Their eyes were all black, just like the story said. They're real." My stomach dropped. The prank had gone too far. I held her, trying to calm her down, telling her it was all just a joke, that it had been Sebastian and maybe a friend helping him out. "Look," I said, "I'll call him right now and he'll tell you himself." I called. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. I left a voicemail and called a third time. Finally, someone picked up. But it wasn't Sebastian. It was his mother. I could tell right away something was wrong. Her voice was trembling as she told me that Sebastian had been in an accident at the skate park that afternoon. He was in the hospital with a fractured skull. He'd been unconscious since before the prank was supposed to happen. I just stood there frozen, holding the phone, listening to her words echo in my head, and realizing that if Sebastian was in the hospital, someone else had knocked on that door. Story 17. A man once checked into a quiet old hotel late one evening. The woman at the front desk was polite but firm as she handed him his key. She told him that, on his way to his room, he would pass a door with no number on it, and that he must not, under any circumstance, open it. "It's just a storeroom," she said, "and it's off limits." She repeated the warning several times, her tone sharper each time, before finally letting him go upstairs. He followed her instructions, went straight to his room, and tried to sleep, but her strange insistence stayed with him. The next night, curiosity got the better of him. He walked quietly down the hall until he found the door with no number. He hesitated for a moment before trying the handle. It was locked, just as she said. He bent down and peered through the wide keyhole. A chill ran through him as a cold draft touched his eye. On the other side, he saw a room nearly identical to his own, but in the corner, facing the wall, was a woman with unnaturally pale skin. She leaned her head against the wall, unmoving, her long hair hanging loosely. He watched for a few seconds, wondering who she was, perhaps the owner's daughter or a celebrity staying in secret. Just as he considered knocking, the woman turned her head sharply toward the door. He jumped back in shock, heart racing, terrified she might have seen him peeking. After a long pause, he crept away and returned to his room. The next morning, he couldn't resist. He returned to the door and looked through the keyhole again. This time, all he saw was red, a deep, solid crimson, no shapes, no movement. It seemed like someone had covered the other side of the keyhole with a red cloth. Embarrassed, he assumed the woman had noticed him spying and blocked the view. Feeling guilty, he decided to speak with the woman at the front desk. At first, she denied knowing anything, but after he pressed her for the truth, she sighed and lowered her voice. "That room hasn't been used in years," she said. "A man once murdered his wife in there. People who stay in that room say they feel watched, so we keep it locked. But the strange thing is," she hesitated, "those people, the ones who used to stay there, they were said to be pure white all over except for their eyes. Their eyes were bright red." Story 18. I had a friend who grew up deep in the Appalachian Mountains. When we were close, he told me something that still makes me uneasy. As a child, he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to see what he called the green face. It would appear above the foot of his bed, staring down at him. Its skin glowed faintly green in the dark, its mouth moving as though whispering words. But no sound ever came out. Terrified, he would squeeze his eyes shut and recite prayers until he fell back asleep. It never touched him or moved closer, just watched. Eventually, he convinced himself it was part of a dream and tried to forget it. Years passed and the family rearranged rooms several times. Each time he moved to another room, the face disappeared. But when he moved back into that same old room, it returned. Always silent, always watching. He never told anyone about it. His family was deeply religious, and he didn't want to be accused of seeing demons. Years later, after college, he and his brother were talking about childhood memories when he finally gathered the courage to ask, "When you used to sleep in my old room, did you ever see anything strange?" His brother looked at him for a long moment and said quietly, "You mean the green face?" My friend said his blood ran cold. He'd spent his whole life convincing himself it wasn't real, that it had been a trick of light or imagination. But now he knew his brother had seen it too, in the same room, describing the same face, the same silent movements. They never discussed it again, other than to confirm it only watched and mumbled without sound. From then on, neither of them would sleep in that room again. Even years later, when they visited their childhood home, that door always stayed closed. There's something deeply wrong about a face that only watches, waiting, generation after generation, for someone to look back. Story 19. There was once a story about a young Chinese couple who had been dating for a few months. The young man eventually grew tired of the relationship and decided to end things. The girl, heartbroken and filled with despair, put on a red dress and jumped to her death. In Chinese folklore, wearing red before dying in such a way means that the spirit will return in 7 days to haunt the one responsible, seeking vengeance. Terrified, the young man went to see a sensei for advice. The sensei told him that the only way to escape the ghost was to hide under his bed on the 7th night. If the ghost couldn't find him in his room, she would leave and never return. As the 7th night arrived, the man did as instructed. As the clock struck midnight, he heard faint, familiar whispers outside his bedroom door. His heart pounded. She had come, but he felt confident. She wouldn't find him under the bed. The doorknob turned slowly and the door creaked open. Then silence. The next morning, the sensei tried to call him to check if he was safe, but there was no answer. Concerned, the sensei went to his apartment. The front door was slightly open. He stepped inside, calling the young man's name, but there was no response. He entered the bedroom and froze. The young man was dead under the bed, his face twisted in pure terror. "That can't be," the sensei whispered. "She shouldn't have been able to see him." Then he noticed a newspaper clipping about the girl's death on the nightstand. It mentioned that she had fallen headfirst from the building. The sensei finally understood. When her spirit came to haunt the room, she came exactly as she died, upside down. Story 20. I've always wanted to share this because it still gives me chills, even though it happened when I was about 10 years old. I used to have a sleepwalking problem. One night, I had a dream that felt incredibly real. In the dream, I got out of bed, walked downstairs, opened the silverware drawer, and picked up a steak knife. Then I climbed the stairs again and stood beside my dad's side of the bed, since he slept closest to the door. He stirred awake and said, "You okay, sweetheart?" In my dream, I started stabbing him. Then my mom woke up, and I started stabbing her too. When it was over, I went back downstairs, laid on the couch, and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, just like in the dream, but the knife was lying on the floor right next to me. My heart dropped. I panicked and sprinted upstairs, terrified of what I might find. But my parents were fine. They were still asleep, unharmed. I was shaking as I went back downstairs, trying to convince myself it had all been a coincidence. Later, when my dad came down for coffee, he asked, "What were you doing last night?" I froze and asked what he meant. He said I'd gotten up, gone downstairs, then come back up and stood next to their bed for several minutes. He even said he asked me what was wrong, but I didn't answer. I just turned and went back downstairs. I didn't know what to say. That moment still haunts me. I don't know whether I was dreaming, awake, or something in between. But every time I think about it, I wonder how close my nightmare came to becoming real. Story 21. When my teacher was a teenager, he went to a camp with his classmates. The camp owner warned everyone that there was one house on the property they must never enter. Its windows and doors were sealed shut, and the owner claimed it was haunted. Curious, the students asked why. The owner told them it used to be an orphanage where the children had been tortured and killed, and that their spirits still lingered inside. Naturally, a few boys, my teacher among them, decided they had to see it for themselves. Late one night, after the owner went to bed, they snuck out and crept toward the forbidden house. When they got inside, it looked normal enough, just old and covered in thick dust. They wandered upstairs to the second floor and found an old rocking chair. One boy sat in it and immediately went pale. "The chair is warm," he whispered. Everyone froze. They decided to leave before anything else happened. But as they reached the stairs, they heard footsteps running across the floor above them. Terrified, they bolted out of the house and didn't stop until they were back in their cabins. The next morning, the camp owner showed up looking shaken and asked if anyone had gone into the house. The boys denied it, afraid of getting in trouble. The owner sighed, visibly frightened. "I thought so," he said quietly. "I woke up last night and saw the lights flicker. When that happens, it means they're moving things again." He paused, his voice trembling. "Those children can move objects. They don't like being disturbed." My teacher said he never forgot the look on the man's face, or the sound of those running footsteps that still echoed in his dreams years later. Story 22. The Villisca Axe murders are one of the most haunting true crime cases I've ever read about. The Moore family, Josiah, age 43, his wife Sarah, age 39, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, lived in a small, peaceful town in Iowa. They were well-liked, respected, and active in their church. On June 9, 1912, the family attended a Children's Day program at their Presbyterian church, which Sarah had helped organize. Their daughter Catherine invited 2 of her friends, Ina and Lena Stillinger, to spend the night afterward. They all walked home together around 10 that evening. The next morning, a neighbor named Mary Peckham noticed something unusual. The house was silent, no one had come out to do the morning chores, and the curtains were still drawn. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. When she tried the handle, she found it locked. Growing worried, she called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who arrived with his own key. Mary waited on the porch as Ross went inside. Moments later, he ran back out, pale and trembling, and told her to call the police. Inside the guest room, he had found the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger, brutally murdered. When Officer Hank Horton arrived, he searched the house and uncovered a nightmare. The entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been slaughtered in their beds. The murder weapon was Josiah's own axe, found in the guest room beside the girls. Doctors later determined the killings took place shortly after midnight. The killer began in the master bedroom, striking Josiah and Sarah first. Josiah received the worst of it. His face was so mutilated that his eyes were gone. The killer then went room by room, bludgeoning each of the children as they slept, before moving downstairs to murder the Stillinger sisters. Evidence showed that all the victims, except Lena, had been asleep when they were attacked. Lena had defensive wounds on her arm and was found lying crosswise on the bed with her nightgown pushed up, suggesting she woke up and fought back before being killed. The most chilling part of the case is what investigators believe happened before the murders. They found cigarette butts and indentations in the dust in the attic, signs that someone had been there, quietly waiting. It's believed the killer hid in the attic, watching and listening as the family returned home, ate their final meal, and went to bed. Then sometime after midnight, he crept down the stairs with Josiah's axe in his hands. The idea that someone could hide in your home, silent and unseen, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, that's what still keeps me awake at night. Story 23. My father was a police officer for over 30 years, and he's told me a lot of disturbing stories, but this one still makes my skin crawl. It happened sometime in the early 1990s. At the time, he was a shift leader, supervising the other officers. One night, around 1 a.m, a patrol officer responded to a 911 call from a suburban home. The call was frantic, full of screaming, and then it cut off. When the officer arrived, every light in the house was on. He knocked several times, calling out, but got no response, though he swore he heard a faint, terrified cry somewhere inside. Fearing the worst, he announced himself, shouted, "Police!" and kicked the door open. The moment he entered, the smell hit him. The place was in chaos, furniture overturned, and what looked like feces smeared on the walls. From upstairs, he suddenly heard a voice yelling, "We're up here!" Mahak! The officer ran up the staircase and found a naked couple huddled in the corner of the master bedroom, wrapped together in a bedsheet. They were shaking violently, covered in filth, their faces pale and eyes wide with horror. The man was clutching a candlestick like a weapon. The officer called for backup, trying to calm them down while piecing together what had happened. When they finally managed to speak, their story was almost impossible to believe. Earlier that evening, around 7 o'clock, they were making dinner when the phone rang. The woman answered. A man's voice introduced himself as the master of torture. He said he was outside their home, watching them through the windows, armed with a shotgun. If they didn't do exactly as he said, he would come inside and kill them both. The husband thought it was a prank until he saw the sheer panic on his wife's face. When he grabbed the phone, the voice told him to listen carefully or die. For the next 5 hours, the stranger forced them, over the phone, to humiliate and hurt each other in the most horrifying ways imaginable. He ordered them to strip naked, smear themselves with their own waste, perform sexual acts, and even harm one another, all while keeping the lights on and curtains open so he could watch. They were too terrified to resist. Finally, when the caller demanded that the man take a knife and cut his wife, he broke down, screamed into the phone, hung up, and dialed 911. Then they ran upstairs and hid, shaking, waiting for help to arrive. The responding officer found them like that, still traumatized, still reeking of fear. My father said that when the story reached him later that night, the part that haunted him most was this. After the house was searched from top to bottom, there was no sign of anyone outside. No footprints in the yard, no car, no hidden observer. The phone line was traced, and the call had come from inside the house. Story 24. It had been 3 long years since Dave and Alice had taken a real vacation. Life had become a blur of work, exhaustion, and caring for their 2-year-old son, Alex. But finally, that weekend, they decided to get away. Just the two of them. They called a trusted family friend to watch Alex, packed their tent and sleeping bags, and drove into the mountains. The campsite was perfect, quiet, shaded by tall pines, and miles from anyone else. After setting up their tent, Dave grabbed a flashlight and went to collect kindling, scout the area, and take a quick bathroom break. He'd been gone less than 10 minutes when Alice called out to him, her voice bright and cheerful. When he returned, she was grinning. She said another couple had passed by and told her about an unmarked trail nearby that led to a waterfall with the most breathtaking view. Dave hesitated, suggesting they check it out later, but Alice insisted it wasn't far and that they should go right away. Reluctantly, he agreed. The trail turned out to be little more than a dried-up creek bed winding around the mountainside. The farther they went, the steeper it became. Alice hiked ahead eagerly, her voice echoing as she called for him to catch up. 5 minutes turned into 10, 10 into 20. The path was rocky now, the trees growing sparse. Dave began to feel uneasy and called out that they should turn back. Alice turned to face him and smiled that wide, familiar grin. "But we're so close," she said. "I can hear the waterfall from here." Then suddenly another voice. Her voice rang out behind him. "Dave, don't!" He spun around and saw Alice, the real Alice, standing a few yards away, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. His breath caught. He looked back at the woman he had been following. She stood motionless, smiling faintly, her hand outstretched toward him. He couldn't move. His mind was spinning. Which one was real? "Dave," the second Alice gasped, "our son is at home. He's 2 years old. His name is Alex. He has your eyes and my nose. Don't touch that thing." It hit him like ice water down his spine. He turned and ran to the trembling woman behind him, the one who knew every detail of their life. She threw her arms around him, sobbing. Together they turned to face the imposter. The thing before them wasn't Alice anymore. It had begun to change, stretching, twisting. Thick matted fur covered its body, its arms too long, ending in jagged claws. Its eyes glowed an impossible burning red. One clawed arm reached out as if beckoning. "Run," Alice whispered. They didn't look back. They tore down the trail, branches whipping at their faces, hearts hammering. When they finally reached their campsite, they ripped down the tent, shoved everything into the car, and sped down the mountain. Only when they reached the highway did they slow down enough to breathe. Between gasping sobs, Alice told him what had happened. She'd been unpacking lunch when Dave approached her, or something that looked like Dave, but he had come from the wrong direction, and when she asked where the firewood was, he looked confused. She'd pretended to need a moment alone, hid until the thing got tired of waiting and left, then went searching for her husband. She found him just in time. That night back at home, they decided not to tell anyone the details. They told their sitter that the mountains weren't as peaceful as they'd hoped, and that they had missed their son too much. They paid her, tucked Alex into bed, and collapsed in their own room, exhausted. "We'll tell the Rangers tomorrow," Dave murmured. "Whatever that thing was, it shouldn't be out there." Alice woke to the sound of a crash. The entire house shook. Dave was already out of bed. "That came from Alex's room. Call the police." Alice grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. She heard Alex crying and ran into the hallway. Then she heard Dave scream, a sound so raw and horrifying it froze her in place. When she reached the room, she found it destroyed. Furniture splintered, the window shattered. Dave lay crumpled against the wall, his body torn open. Claw marks raked across his face. Alex sat in the middle of the chaos, crying softly. She dropped the phone and ran to him, scooping him into her arms, sobbing. He clung to her tightly, silent now, his little face pressed into her shoulder. The wall behind them was torn open, a gaping hole that led into the darkness outside. Whatever had killed Dave had come through there. Somehow it had followed them home. But Alex was safe. Dave had died protecting him. She picked up the phone and spoke to the operator in a trembling voice, saying only what she thought they'd believe. A break-in, a wild animal, her husband dead. When she hung up, she looked at her son and whispered, "It's over now. You're safe." He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stared up at her with wide, calm eyes. Then she turned toward the hole in the wall and froze. It was massive, far larger than the creature they'd seen in the mountains. A cold realization sank in. It could change size. Her breath caught in her throat as Alex's small arms tightened around her neck. She couldn't bring herself to look down at him. The thing in her arms was too quiet. Story 25. Back in 2008, I was interning at a home for people with both mental and physical disabilities. The building had a small playground outside, an old swing set, a slide, and a patch of sand, but it was rarely used. You could always see it clearly through the large glass door at the end of the corridor. One evening, only my older coworker and I were on duty. We had finished putting everyone to bed, and I was going around locking up before heading home for the night. The night watchman was due to arrive shortly. When I reached the glass door, keys in hand, I froze. Someone was sitting on the swing. It was private property, and that playground was surrounded by a tall fence. Nobody should have been there. I called my coworker over, my voice shaking a little, and asked what to do. She came to the door, peered outside, then opened it just a crack and called out for the stranger to leave. He didn't move. She raised her voice, saying that if he didn't go immediately, she would call the police. That's when he stood up and began walking toward us. My coworker slammed the door shut and locked it. The figure stopped just a few feet away from the glass and stood there, motionless. His entire body was covered in black clothing, even his face. We couldn't see his eyes, his skin, nothing. He just stared at us. After what felt like forever, he turned and wandered off into the dark. We told the night watchman as soon as he arrived and asked him to keep an eye out. But the man was gone. We never saw him again. Still, every time I worked a late shift after that, I couldn't help glancing out the window, half expecting to see that shadowy figure sitting on the swing again. Story 26. A man checked into a quiet old hotel one night. At the front desk, the woman gave him his key but warned him firmly that there was one door on his floor, a door with no number, that was strictly off limits. "It's just a storeroom," she said, repeating herself several times. "No one is allowed inside." The man nodded, thinking her insistence strange, but said nothing and went to his room. That first night passed uneventfully, but the next evening his curiosity got the better of him. He walked down the hall until he found the unmarked door. The handle was cold and, as expected, locked. He bent down and peered through the keyhole. A chill of air brushed his eye. Inside, he could see a room that looked almost identical to his own. a simple hotel bedroom. In the corner stood a woman, pale as chalk, leaning her head against the wall, facing away from him. She didn't move. Puzzled, he almost knocked, but something in him hesitated. Just then, the woman turned sharply. He jumped back, heart pounding, afraid she might have caught him spying. He hurried back to his room and tried to sleep. The next day, unable to resist, he returned to the door. When he looked again through the keyhole, he saw only red, a deep, unmoving crimson. Embarrassed, he assumed she had placed something over the keyhole, maybe a piece of fabric, to block his view. Feeling guilty for invading her privacy, he went downstairs and asked the woman at the desk about the room. After some hesitation, she sighed and said quietly, "A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room. People still say they feel strange staying near it, but those two weren't ordinary." She paused. They were white all over, except for their eyes. Their eyes were red. Story 27. About a year ago, one of my Marines showed me a documentary about a serial murderer and rapist from Long Island, and I swear it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever watched. I'm not someone who scares easily, but this film was different. It was raw, unsettling, and felt way too real. It began as an investigation into an old mental hospital for children, one that had supposedly been shut down decades earlier. The footage they showed was straight out of the 1980s, grainy and color-faded, the kind of thing that already feels cursed before you even know what you're watching. The reporter described the place as a breeding ground for neglect and cruelty. The video showed kids wandering naked through filthy hallways, their faces blank, their bodies covered in grime and feces. Some looked lobotomized, others barely conscious. The staff, when they were even there, didn't seem to care at all. They let the children rot. Some of the footage showed orderlies doing substances, laughing in the background, while those kids stumbled through their misery. The hospital had one particularly disturbing feature, a network of underground tunnels. Officially, they were meant for storage. In reality, the staff used them for substances, for abuse, for things the documentary didn't even fully describe. When the scandal broke, the hospital was shut down, and the surviving children were relocated. But not all of them had families to return to. Many disappeared into foster care or group homes. Some were too damaged, mentally broken, unstable, and simply vanished from the system. Then years later, a wave of brutal murders began in the same area. Victims were found mutilated, some left in wooded areas near where the hospital once stood. The documentary crew suggested that some of the missing children, now grown, might be responsible. They filmed themselves exploring the ruins, crawling through the old tunnels, their flashlights flickering over graffiti, discarded syringes, and piles of rotting debris. They found abandoned camps, evidence of squatters, and what looked like crime scene remnants, old rape kits, rusted chains, and torn clothing buried in the dirt. The deeper they went, the worse it got. The camera would catch glimpses of shapes in the dark. Maybe shadows, maybe people. But the crew never found anyone. By the end, the film didn't offer answers, just despair. The last shots were of the tunnels fading into blackness, the narrator's voice shaking as he admitted that no one really knew how many victims there were, or who or what was still down there. The whole thing left me cold. I'd seen plenty of horror movies, but this one didn't feel like fiction. It felt like a window into something that should have stayed buried. Story 28. My dad told me this story from when he was a teenager growing up in Mexico City. One weekend, he and a group of friends decided to go hiking and camping in the mountains near Puebla. They caught a bus to a small town at the base of the range, then spent the afternoon hiking up until they found a spot to make camp. As night fell, they built a fire, passed around a stolen bottle of tequila, and joked like teenagers do. Then one of them pointed across the ridge and said, "What are those lights?"